Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1: The Body in Belgrave Lane. The fog had rolled in thick and yellow that November evening, wrapping itself about the narrow streets of Westminster like a living thing. It dulled the lamplight, muffled the clatter of hooves, and turned the whole district into a ghostly tableau. Belgrave Lane, ordinarily so respectable, so quiet, was deserted but for the occasional milk cart and the faint tread of an early riser on the pavement. It was 6:15 when the scream shattered that eerie calm. Mr. Thomas Wren, the milkman, would later declare that it was not the sort of sound one forgets, a single, high cry, half-choked, followed by silence so profound that even the fog seemed to hold its breath. Thinking someone had fallen or been attacked, Wren turned the corner and stopped short beneath the dim circle of a gas lamp. A man lay sprawled on the wet cobblestones, his face turned towards the gutter, one arm twisted beneath him. The milkman, trembling, bent down and touched the shoulder. The body was still warm. Then he saw the dark stain spreading upon the man's overcoat and ran for the nearest constable. By the time the police arrived, the little street had begun to stir. Windows opened, doors creaked, and cautious faces peered into the fog. The inspector from the local station wasted no time in sending for Scotland Yard, for even at a glance the scene was curious. The man's clothing, well-cut but modest, spoke of a person of means, not a common vagrant. His pockets, upon examination, contained money, a gold watch, and a theatre ticket for that very evening. Clearly, robbery was not the motive. It was precisely this sort of puzzle that appealed to one man more than any other, and by fortunate chance, that man was only a few streets away. Hercule Poirot, the celebrated Belgian detective, had been taking tea with his acquaintance, Mrs. Withers, when word of the murder reached him through the excited chatter of her maid. Within minutes, Poirot's hat was on his head, his cane in hand, and his immaculate boot stepping briskly into the mist. Belgrave Lane presented a strange picture as he arrived. Policemen moved like shadows, their lanterns cutting brief tunnels through the fog. Curious residents lingered behind their curtains. Poirot greeted Inspector Japp, an old ally of many a baffling case, with a courteous nod. "Ah, mon ami," said Poirot, his moustaches quivering in the lamplight. "I arrive, it seems, at the hour of tragedy." Japp gave a rueful grin. "You might call it that, though I'll confess, I'm stumped already. Fellow's been done in neat as you please, one clean stab to the heart. Nothing taken, no struggle. Looks almost surgical." Poirot leaned over the body, adjusting the crease of his trousers fastidiously before kneeling. His eyes, bright and quick, missed nothing, not the placement of the hands, not the small smear of mud upon one heel, nor the fact that the man's hat lay some distance away, perfectly upright. "You see, my good Japp," he murmured, "how precise, how tidy is this crime. Our murderer is not the man of passion. None, he is calm, controlled." The act was over in one instant. He gestured delicately towards the pavement. "And observe, there is a single line of footprints leading toward the body, small, narrow, with the heel slightly worn. Yet none leading away. Tell me, how can a man commit murder and then vanish into the air?" Japp scowled. "The fog's thick enough to swallow an army, Poirot. Could be they just blurred away in the damp." "Could be," Poirot agreed thoughtfully, though the faint smile playing about his lips suggested he did not think so. The body was turned carefully. The face revealed was that of a man of about 50, pale, distinguished, with neatly trimmed sideburns and a faint expression of surprise rather than fear. Poirot noted the absence of any defensive wound. "Whoever killed him," he said quietly, "was known to him. The good monsieur was taken unawares, perhaps by a friend. The constable handed over the items found in the man's pockets. Poirot examined them in turn, a wallet containing a modest sum, a silver watch, several neatly folded papers, and the theatre ticket, stamped the Royal Pavilion, Row C, Seat 12. He raised his brows slightly. A man goes to the theatre, and instead, he meets death in a lonely street. There is irony in that, Jap. Name's Leonard Havisham, said Jap, consulting his notebook. Retired solicitor. Lived not far from here with his sister. Everyone says he's a quiet type. Bit dull, by the sound of it. Ah, but dullness, mon cher, is sometimes the best disguise for danger. Poirot stood, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. And the sister, has she been told? Just now. Poor lady's near fainted, they say. Poirot's expression softened. ABN, we shall see her soon. But first, I make a little promenade. He began to pace slowly around the lamplit circle, his gaze darting from gutter to wall. Then he paused, crouched, and with the tip of his cane touched something faint upon the brickwork, a smear of white. Paint, he murmured. Fresh, still tacky. Someone was working here recently. He followed the mark to a short ladder lying beside the wall, its rungs damp with fog. A painter's tools, brush, cloth, tin, stood stacked by the railings. Poirot tapped them gently, his eyes half closed in thought. Tell me, Jap, have we questioned the workman? Not yet. There's supposed to be one on this street, a Mr. Albert Longley. Lives over the shop at the corner. Poirot straightened. Then let us make his acquaintance soon. Meanwhile, we note the paint, the footprints, the theatre ticket. 3 little points, each insignificant alone, yet together, who knows? Jap laughed. You and your little grey cells, Poirot. You'll have this solved before I've finished my cigar. Poirot gave him a gentle bow. Perhaps, mon ami. Or perhaps it will be one of those cases where everything is simple, except the truth. As they covered the body and prepared to move it, Poirot lingered for one last look at the lonely patch of pavement beneath the lamplight. The fog had grown thicker still, swirling in slow, ghostly shapes. Somewhere, a church bell tolled the hour. He turned to Jap. You see, my friend, this street, so quiet, so respectable, it has heard a cry of death tonight. But the echo of that cry will not fade until we find the reason for it. For there is always a reason, and always, behind it, a mind. We shall find both. And with that, Hercule Poirot, the little man with the egg-shaped head and the most formidable intellect in London, walked away through the fog, leaving Belgrave Lane to its uneasy silence. Chapter 2, The Man with No Enemies. By mid-morning the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the orderly elegance of Rutland Gardens, a narrow crescent of respectable houses with polished brass knockers and curtains always drawn at the proper height. It was there that Mr. Leonard Havisham had lived, quietly and without fuss, in number 7 with his widowed sister, Miss Emily Havisham. The blinds were drawn, and the air inside was thick with the sorrow that clings to a house newly bereaved. A maid, red-eyed and nervous, showed Hercule Poirot and Inspector Jap into a drawing-room that spoke of comfort without extravagance. Everything gleamed, polished mahogany, neatly arranged books, and a small vase of chrysanthemums upon the mantelpiece. Miss Havisham sat very still in a high-backed chair by the fire. She was a woman of perhaps 50, upright and composed, her grey hair drawn tightly back beneath a net. Her eyes, when she looked up, were pale and rimmed with sleeplessness, yet they held the unmistakable steadiness of one accustomed to self-control. Poirot bowed with grave courtesy. Mademoiselle, I am deeply sorry for your loss. We come, alas, on a most unhappy duty. She inclined her head. I understand, Monsieur Poirot. Inspector Jap explained who you were. If there is anything I can tell you that will help, though I confess I cannot imagine who would wish to harm my brother." Her voice faltered slightly on the last words, but she mastered herself. Poirot took a seat opposite, his gloved hands folded upon his knees. "Let us begin simply," he said gently. "Your brother, he was in good health?" "He had no anxieties of a financial or personal nature." "None whatever," she replied at once. Leonard was a creature of routine. He rose at 7, read the Times, took a walk in the park, and spent most of his time in his study since his retirement. He was a man of quiet habits. He disliked change. "Pardon, mademoiselle," Poirot murmured, "but change comes to us all, does it not? Last evening, for example, he went out, I believe." She nodded. "Yes. At 7:30, as always. He said he had a private appointment. I did not inquire where." Leonard was discreet to a fault. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "He told you nothing of the nature of this appointment?" "Only that it was important." "He seemed preoccupied. When he did not return by midnight, I feared he had been delayed. It was not until the police came this morning that Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Poirot inclined his head respectfully and changed his tone to one of quiet practicality. "You say, mademoiselle, that your brother had retired from practice. As a solicitor, perhaps he had clients who continued to seek his advice." "Occasionally," she admitted. "Old friends, mostly. He did not take payment, of course. Leonard liked to feel useful." "And among these friends," Poirot persisted softly, "was there anyone who might have reason to feel resentment? Perhaps a case that ended unhappily?" Miss Havisham frowned. "You make it sound as though Leonard could have made enemies. That is absurd. He was universally respected." "Ah, but respect and affection are not twins," Poirot murmured. "A man may be admired, and still disliked." Before she could reply, the maid entered with a small tray. "Inspector, sir," she said timidly, "the constable's back with Mr. Havisham's watch and wallet. They was returned from the station." Poirot held out a delicate hand. "Permit me, if you please." He examined the items with care. The watch was of fine silver, recently wound. The wallet contained a few banknotes, several visiting cards, and a small envelope addressed simply Th. He noted the initials but said nothing. Replacing the items neatly, he rose. "Thank you, mademoiselle. One last question, if I may. Did your brother ever speak of attending the theatre?" She blinked. "The theatre? No, indeed. Leonard had no interest in such things." Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp. "And yet, in his pocket we found a ticket for the Royal Pavilion, row C, seat 12. Miss Havisham looked genuinely astonished. "A ticket? That cannot be right. He never went to plays." "Nevertheless," Poirot said softly, "he intended to, last night." She sank back, visibly shaken. "I cannot explain it. Unless someone gave it to him." Poirot regarded her keenly. "Someone? A friend, perhaps?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. Leonard was not what you'd call sociable. Since his retirement, he saw few people." "Indeed," said Poirot gently, rising once more. "Then we must look elsewhere for our answer." Outside, Japp drew a deep breath of cold air. "Well, that's that. A quiet life, no enemies, no debts, and no reason anyone should want him dead. The world's full of madmen, I suppose." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, you are too English, my friend. You think murder is born of passion or madness. But sometimes it is born of the most respectable motive of all, convenience. Japp chuckled. Convenience. You mean someone found him inconvenient? Perhaps. Poirot began to stroll along the pavement, his cane tapping lightly. But observe, Japp, the method of death. A single stab, clean, to the heart. Not the blow of a thief or a madman, but of one who knows precisely what he does. You think it's personal, then? Everything, mon ami, is personal. Even indifference. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Japp said, "Well, where next?" "You mentioned that theatre ticket." "Oh, the theatre," Poirot agreed. "For it is there that our Monsieur Havisham meant to go." A man of routine, who detests noise and crowds, suddenly decides to attend a performance. Non. There is a reason. Perhaps he was to meet someone there. Someone who will not appear in his sister's tidy world. They reached the corner of Belgrave Lane, where the fog hung low once more, clinging to the railings like damp lace. Poirot paused to look at the ground where the body had lain. The white smear of paint had already been washed by rain, but the faint impression of the footprints remained, a ghostly trace in the mud. "You see, Japp," he said softly, "the footprints come from the north side of the street, the direction of Rutland Gardens. Our victim walked from his home to his death. He met no one along the way, spoke to no one. And yet, somewhere between his door and this spot, fate waited for him." Japp rubbed his chin. "You mean, someone followed him?" "Or someone awaited him," Poirot replied. "The question is, who knew his appointment?" They stood in silence as the lamplighter passed, lifting his pole to the glass globes one by one. The lamps flared weakly against the thickening dusk. Poirot watched him, his eyes far away. "A life of order, of routine," he murmured. "A man with no enemies. Yet the pattern breaks, just once, and within an hour, he lies dead. Such deviations, my friend, are never accidents." Japp gave a grunt of agreement. "So, the theatre next, eh?" Poirot smiled. "Exactly. Let us go where Monsieur Havisham did not arrive. There, perhaps, we shall find the shadow that walks behind him." As they moved off down the quiet street, the mist curled around them once more, and Belgrave Lane returned to its stillness, a street outwardly unchanged, yet now forever touched by the echo of a single, unanswerable question. Who had Leonard Havisham gone to meet? Chapter 3. The Theatre Ticket. The Royal Pavilion Theatre stood proudly at the corner of St. James's Street, its stone façade streaked with soot, its golden letters glinting dully through the damp London air. Though it was only midday, the faint echoes of the previous night's applause seemed to linger in the empty corridor as Poirot and Inspector Japp were shown inside. The theatre's manager, a plump and anxious gentleman named Mr. Henry Flockton, greeted them in his office with visible unease. "A dreadful business, gentlemen," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "A murder, you say, and the poor fellow was to attend here? I had no idea." Poirot inclined his head politely. "Monsieur Flockton, we thank you for your assistance. You will understand, the gentleman's presence here last night may be of the utmost importance." The manager nodded, fidgeting with a fountain pen. Of course. I have the ticket records right here." He opened a large ledger, turning its pages with care. "Row C, seat 12, you said?" "Yes, here it is. Booked 3 days ago, paid for in cash. No name given, though that's not unusual for last-minute sales." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, monsieur. But perhaps you recall who purchased it?" Mr. Flockton frowned. "I'm afraid not personally. But wait," he pressed a buzzer. "Miss Talbot, could you come here a moment?" A young woman entered, brisk, fair-haired, and businesslike. "Yes, Mr. Flockton." Miss Talbot, said the manager, these gentlemen are from the police. They're asking about a gentleman who was to occupy row C, seat 12 last night. The girl's brow furrowed. Row C, seat 12, yes, I remember. A tall, quiet gentleman, rather distinguished looking. He collected his ticket early in the evening, about 7 o'clock, I think. Poirot leaned forward. And he came alone? Yes, sir. But later, just before the curtain rose, a lady came in and asked for him. She said she was to meet him here, but he hadn't arrived yet. Japp perked up. A lady, eh? Can you describe her? Miss Talbot hesitated. Medium height, well-dressed, wearing a grey cloak with a hood. I couldn't see much of her face, the fog was dreadful. She seemed anxious, though. When I told her the gentleman hadn't come, she waited in the foyer for a while, then left. I never saw her again. Poirot's moustache bristled with interest. Très bien, mademoiselle. You recall any other detail? Her voice, perhaps. The girl considered. Soft, refined. English, certainly. And she wore gloves, pale grey ones to match her cloak. Poirot smiled faintly. Merci. You have the memory of a detective, mademoiselle. Do not lose it. When they had thanked her and stepped out into the street again, Japp exhaled sharply. So, we've a lady in grey now. I might have guessed. There's always a woman somewhere, isn't there? Poirot's eye sparkled. Mon cher, do not mock the fair sex. Where there is woman, there is motive, and often, reason. But tell me, what do you make of this meeting? Well, said Japp, either she meant to meet him there and he was waylaid on his way, or she lured him out and never intended him to reach the theatre at all. Poirot nodded approvingly. Excellent, Japp. You are learning to think like the little grey cells. Yes, there are two possibilities, and both lead us back to the same question, who is the lady? He stopped abruptly at the corner, glancing back at the Grand Theatre entrance, his gaze distant. Let us suppose, he said thoughtfully, that Monsieur Havisham was indeed to meet this lady. She purchases her own ticket, he purchases his. The arrangement is secret. Why? Because they do not wish to be observed together. An affair, suggested Japp. Possibly, said Poirot. Or possibly something less romantic, but equally dangerous. That afternoon they returned to Scotland Yard to review what had been gathered from Havisham's home. Among the deceased's papers was a short note written in neat, firm script. Royal Pavilion. 8 o'clock. We must speak privately. C. Poirot examined the note under the light, then handed it silently to Japp. C.A., said Japp. Could stand for anything, Clara, Catherine, Charlotte. Or just the letter C for confidential or dot. Non, Poirot murmured. You are too literal. It is not the meaning of the letter but the intention of the writer that interests me. Observe the pressure of the pen, firm but elegant. A woman's hand, I think, but one accustomed to writing businesslike letters. He smiled faintly. And you see, the wording, we must speak privately. There is no affection, no sentimentality. Urgency, yes, emotion, none. That is not the letter of a lover. It is the summons of one who holds power, or fear. Japp frowned. You think she was threatening him? I think, said Poirot, that she required him to explain something. And that, mon ami, can be far more dangerous than a lover's quarrel. By the following morning, Poirot's inquiries had borne fruit. A clerk at the pavilion's box office, after a gentle nudge from Poirot's charm and a hint of his reputation, recalled that the lady in grey had left her cloak in the cloakroom for a short time. It had been labelled Mrs. Linton, Mayfair. Japp whistled. That's our woman, then. Mrs. Linton of Mayfair. Now we're getting somewhere. Poirot nodded slowly. Indeed. And if my memory does not deceive me, there was a Mr. Linton, a financier, involved in an unfortunate scandal some years ago. Fraud, I think. He escaped conviction but died soon after. Yes, very curious. Japp grunted. So, the widow of a disgraced businessman and a retired solicitor meet secretly at the theatre. Could be blackmail. Could be, Poirot said softly. Or something more delicate, a matter of conscience, perhaps. He straightened his tie with that unhurried precision that always accompanied the sharpening of his thoughts. We shall visit Mrs. Linton. But not today. Today, we observe. That evening, Poirot returned alone to Belgrave Lane. The rain had ceased, but the pavements were still damp, reflecting the faint orange glow of the street lamps. He paused at the exact spot where Leonard Havisham had fallen. The milkman's chalk marks were still faintly visible, a ghostly outline upon the stones. He bent down, studying the ground once more. The footprints, narrow, deep, then abruptly vanishing, troubled him still. He moved closer to the wall, where he had seen the faint smear of white paint. Now, in the clearer light, he noticed something else, a small chip of dried plaster, embedded in the crevice near the railings. He examined it carefully with his pocket lens. Plaster, he murmured. And of fine quality, not for outdoor work. Something from an interior wall. Curious. He straightened and gazed upward. Across the lane rose a narrow building, its upper floor dark, a to let sign swinging faintly in the breeze. The lower window bore a freshly painted frame, and inside, a faint smell of turpentine drifted out. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, the painter, Mr. Longley, he whispered to himself. He is still at work, I see. Perhaps he has seen more than he knows. When he rejoined Japp later that night, the inspector was poring over reports. Nothing new, he said with frustration. No witnesses, no weapon, no trace of anyone leaving the scene. On the contrary, said Poirot mildly, we have found a most interesting witness, a silent one. Japp looked up. Oh? Who? Poirot smiled. The lady in grey, Mon Ami, and the footprints that go only one way. Between them, they will tell us everything. But first. He looked thoughtfully at the fogged window pane. We must hear what Mrs. Linton herself has to say. And outside, the rain began again, soft, persistent, and full of secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 4: The Neighbour's Secret. The next morning dawned bleak and windless. A dull mist hung over Belgrave Lane, softening the outlines of the lampposts and making every sound seem oddly distant. Hercule Poirot stood at the corner, gloved hands clasped neatly behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the house opposite, the narrow, unlit building whose upper window bore the faint marks of recent painting. Inspector Japp joined him, his overcoat turned up against the damp. Early start for you, Poirot, he remarked, lighting a cigarette. You're as punctual as a milkman. Poirot's moustaches twitched with amusement. When one is hunting truth, Mon Ami, it is best to arrive before it escapes. And truth, I think, lives somewhere in that building. He nodded toward the small house across the lane. A wooden ladder still leaned against the wall, a half-used tin of white paint resting at its foot. Through the open doorway came the faint smell of plaster and turpentine. Japp followed him inside. The hallway was narrow, the air sharp with the cold of disuse. From an upper room came the steady scrape of a brush and the rhythm of a man humming tunelessly to himself. Poirot mounted the stairs delicately, avoiding the damp patches on the carpet. Mr. Albert Longley, he called gently. The sound ceased at once. A moment later, a man appeared on the landing, short, thin, and nervous, his hand speckled with paint. His eyes darted from Poirot to Japp with unmistakable anxiety. "That's me," he said. "What's this about?" Poirot regarded him kindly. "Do not be alarmed, monsieur. We come only to ask a few little questions. You were painting here on the evening of the murder in Belgrave Lane, were you not?" Longley shifted uneasily. "Aye, that's right. Been working on this place for a week now. No one lives here yet, owner wants it freshened up before letting." "You were here late?" "Till near 9, sir. Needed to finish the window frames before the rain started." Poirot inclined his head. "And during that time, you heard something, perhaps? A cry, a quarrel?" The painter hesitated. "I heard footsteps, maybe someone walking quick. Then there was a sort of noise, like someone gasping. I thought it was just the wind at first." Japp leaned forward. "You didn't look out?" Longley flushed. "It was dark, and I had the lights on in here. Couldn't see much through the fog. When I did go down later, I saw people gathering. A policeman said a man been murdered right outside. Gave me quite a turn." Poirot watched him steadily. "And yet, monsieur, you did not come forward." I didn't think I'd seen anything useful," Longley stammered. "Didn't seem worth bothering the police with." "Ah, but you did see something," said Poirot softly. "Or rather, something saw you." Longley blinked. "I don't follow." Poirot took from his pocket a small magnifying glass and crossed to the freshly painted window frame. "The paint here," he said, "was wet on the night of the crime. Yet, near the lower edge, see, a smear of red. Not the paint, but blood. The painter's face drained of colour." "Blood? Good Lord! How?" Poirot raised a delicate hand. "Do not fear, monsieur. I do not say it is yours. But it is curious, is it not? The murderer strikes a blow, the victim falls, and in the act of departing, or arriving, the murderer brushes against this frame. Perhaps they steadied themselves here for one instant. Voila, but trace left behind." Japp crouched beside Poirot, examining the spot. "So the killer might have come through this very window?" "Possibly," Poirot said. "Or used the balcony above to descend unseen. Remember, Japp, there were no returning footprints on the street. Perhaps because our murderer did not walk away at all, but climbed." Longley swallowed hard. "You think someone climbed up here? That's madness. These old frames wouldn't hold a child's weight." Poirot's eyes glinted. "You are certain of that, monsieur? Yet the ladder outside, that could easily have served. Was it there that evening?" Yes, it was. I left it against the wall before I went inside." Poirot nodded. "Then perhaps another used it, unseen by you, to reach the balcony above. You worked with your back to the window, did you not?" Longley looked uneasy. "I didn't pay much attention to the lane." "Just so," said Poirot. "One may see nothing, and yet be seen by everyone." He let his gaze wander about the room, the paint tins, the neat brushes, the folded dust sheets. On the mantel lay a battered flask. Poirot picked it up delicately. "You take tea with you, monsieur?" "Sometimes," Longley said, quickly. "Or a bit of gin, maybe. Helps with the cold." Poirot replaced the flask without comment. "Tell me, monsieur, did you know Mr. Havisham, the gentleman who was killed?" The painter's expression froze. "Never met him." Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone grew almost tender. "You say that, and yet, you live but 2 doors from his home, do you not? It is strange that one neighbour does not at least see another." Longley's lips tightened. I keep to myself, sir. Not my sort of company, them fine folks. Japp intervened, brusque but not unkind. All right, Mr. Longley. That'll do for now. Don't go disappearing anywhere, understand? The painter nodded quickly. Wouldn't dream of it. As they stepped back into the lane, Poirot paused, glancing up at the building once more. You see, Japp, the good Mr. Longley is frightened. Of what? Japp asked. We've barely raised our voices. Not of us, Poirot murmured. Of something, or someone else. They walked a little way in silence. Then Poirot stopped before the next house, the Havisham's residence. Its drawn blinds and silent windows seemed to brood over the narrow street. Consider, my friend, he said quietly. We have three elements, the murdered man, the painter who heard but did not see, and the mysterious lady in grey who waited for one who never came. Each of these is a fragment. And yet, when one arranges the fragments, he made a small, precise gesture with his hands, they will form a pattern. Japp looked unconvinced. All I see so far is fog, footsteps, and a painter who drinks. Poirot smiled indulgently. Ah, but fog, footsteps, and a painter may yet hide the truth. It is always the ordinary things, mon ami, that conceal the extraordinary. He turned abruptly, pointing with his cane to a small brass plate by the wall. See there, to let. The house stands empty, and yet someone has opened the upper window. Why, I wonder? Japp frowned. You think our murderer could have slipped in there, then climbed down into the lane? Perhaps, said Poirot. But even more interesting, why that house, of all others? The place directly opposite the Havishams. From there, one could watch every movement at number 7. The inspector gave a low whistle. So the killer might have been watching Havisham for days. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Exactly. The stage was chosen long before the curtain rose. He straightened his cuffs, casting a final glance up at the silent window above. Come, Japp. We must now pay a visit to the lady whose name begins with C. I have a feeling her story, like our street, is not as quiet as it appears. As they walked away, the painter's silhouette reappeared at the upper window, watching them go. He stood there long after they had vanished into the mist, his brush idle, his expression haunted by something he could not, or dared not, say. Chapter 5, The Grey Cloak. The morning sun had returned to London with reluctant brightness, glancing coldly off the white façades of Mayfair. It was 10:30 when Hercule Poirot and Inspector Japp were shown into the drawing-room of Mrs. Clara Linton, widow of the late financier Arthur Linton. The room spoke of refined taste and restrained expense, French curtains, pale damask chairs, a marble clock that ticked with measured decorum. Mrs. Linton herself rose as they entered. She was tall, slender, perhaps in her late 30s, her complexion delicate against the dark silk of her morning gown. Only her eyes, grey like a winter sea, betrayed a certain restlessness. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, and Mr. Hercule Poirot, she said with a faint smile. Your visit is unusual, gentlemen. What can I do for you? Japp inclined his head. It's about Mr. Leonard Havisham, madam. I believe you may have arranged to meet him last night at the Royal Pavilion Theatre. At once a flicker of tension crossed her features, a tightening of the mouth, swiftly mastered. I did go to the pavilion, she said. But Mr. Havisham never arrived. I waited some time and then returned home. I only learned this morning, from the papers, that he was found dead. It was, she hesitated, a dreadful shock. Poirot, ever the courteous observer, noted how her gloved fingers twisted slightly against one another. Madam, he said softly, will you permit me to express my deepest sympathy? It is never pleasant to be drawn, however innocently, into a tragedy. She inclined her head. Thank you, Mr. Poirot. I scarcely knew him well. Yet well enough, said Poirot, to arrange a meeting in secret. For a moment she met his gaze without flinching. Not in secret. Simply, privately. There were matters from my late husband's affairs which required Mr. Havisham's advice. He had been our solicitor years ago. Japp looked up from his notebook. Affairs to do with the old fraud case, perhaps. Her eyes flashed. My husband was never guilty, Inspector. He was the victim of others' deceit. Mr. Havisham defended him as best he could, though it ruined us both in the end. Poirot's tone was gentle. And yet, madam, you sought him out again, after so many years. She drew a slow breath. Yes. I discovered certain papers among my husband's belongings, papers that raised new doubts about who was truly to blame. I thought Mr. Havisham could help me understand them. You asked him to meet you at the theatre, said Poirot, and he agreed. He wrote that he would bring with him something which might explain everything. He suggested we meet before the performance began. The foyer would be less conspicuous than his home. That was his idea, not mine. Poirot nodded gravely. And this something, you never saw it? No, she shook her head. When he failed to appear, I assumed he had changed his mind. Or, murmured Poirot, that someone changed it for him. A faint tremor passed across her face. You mean? Only that a man who fears exposure is often silenced by those he endangers. Tell me, madam, did anyone else know of your intended meeting? No one, she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. I have not spoken of it to a soul. Poirot's gaze travelled thoughtfully to a small photograph on the mantelpiece, a dark-haired man in uniform, her late husband, no doubt. Beneath it lay a letter sealed with black ribbon. The room, he thought, was that of a woman who lived with memories carefully arranged, yet still raw beneath the polish. Forgive me, madam, he said, if I ask one question more. The grey cloak you wore last night, you left it at the cloakroom for a time. She looked surprised. Why, yes. The fog had dampened it. How extraordinary that you should know. Poirot smiled faintly. The little grey cells, madam, they are inquisitive creatures. They like to know what is hung up and what is not. Her lips curved despite herself. I see I am no match for you, Mr. Poirot. Few are, muttered Japp under his breath. Poirot rose. I thank you for your courtesy, madam. We will not detain you longer, though I may have more questions later. As they took their leave, Mrs. Linton's composure slipped just enough for Poirot to notice the faint quiver of her hand upon the chair back. He bowed slightly, his eyes gentle. Courage, madam. Truth is often a heavy visitor, but it leaves the house cleaner when it departs. Outside, the sharp air of Mayfair bit their cheeks. Japp exhaled a cloud of smoke. Well, she's a fine actress, that one. Couldn't tell if she's heartbroken or hiding something. Both, perhaps, said Poirot. She tells much truth and conceals one small lie. Japp raised an eyebrow. Which lie? Poirot tapped his temple. She said no one knew of her meeting. Yet she wrote to Mr. Havisham, and letters are seldom as private as we imagine. Someone read that note, mon ami, or overheard her plan. That someone made sure the meeting never happened. They walked a little way in silence, their footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. So, we've got this painter chap who's nervous as a rabbit, and now a widow with secrets, Japp said. I'm beginning to think your Belgrave Lane's busier than Piccadilly Circus. Poirot chuckled softly. Ah, but here the traffic is of the human heart. One wrong turn, and bang. Catastrophe. He grew thoughtful. Let us recall the facts. Monsieur Havisham receives a note signed C. He leaves his home at 7:30. He never reaches the theatre. He is found dead within 100 yards of his door. Therefore, the danger met him between those 2 points. And who lives within those 2 points? Japp? Japp frowned. The Havisham house, the empty one opposite, and that painter. Precisely, said Poirot. And of those 3, which offers both concealment and access? The empty house. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Just so. Someone used it, either to watch or to act. We must discover who had keys, and when the workmen were dismissed. He stopped abruptly. You will see, mon ami, this is not a crime of impulse. It is the work of one who plans, carefully, coldly, tidily. The blow itself was clean, the mind behind it, neater still. Neatness again, grumbled Japp. You and your neatness. Poirot smiled. But of course. Murder committed by a tidy mind always leaves the smallest disorder. It is there, in that one imperfection, that I shall find my truth. That afternoon, as the pale sun slipped behind the chimneys, Poirot sat alone in his flat in Whitechapel, sipping hot chocolate and gazing at the array of notes before him. A map of Belgrave Lane lay spread on the table, footprints, timings, windows, doors, every element marked in his fine, precise handwriting. At the edge he had written 3 words in capital letters, paint, letter, woman. He studied them for a long while. Then, very slowly, he drew a 4th line beneath and added a single word, sister. He leaned back, the faintest smile curving his lips. Yes, he murmured, the pattern begins to take shape. The lady in grey may not hold the knife, but she holds the key. And soon, the little grey cell shall unlock the door. Chapter 6, Shadows of the Past. It was a grey, windless afternoon when Hercule Poirot and Inspector Japp returned to Belgrave Lane, the narrow street now half forgotten by the world beyond its fog-stained lamp-posts. The murder of Leonard Havisham had already begun to fade from the newspapers, replaced by fresher scandals, but not from Poirot's mind. For him, the crime still stood like an unfinished equation, neat, precise, but incomplete. Japp, puffing on his pipe, trudged beside him. I've been to Havisham's old firm, he said. They say he retired 10 years ago, health reasons, they claim. But I've looked deeper. He'd been quietly investing clients' funds, risky ventures, hush-hush. Could have been ruinous if discovered. Ah. Poirot's eyes brightened. So the good Mr. Havisham had a talent for discretion, and perhaps for danger also. Seems that way. There's more, one of the clients he lost money for was none other than the late Arthur Linton. There was a whisper of a scandal, but Havisham wasn't named. The poor devil covered it up, paid what he could, and left the law. Mrs. Linton may not even know. Poirot stopped at the edge of the pavement. Or she may know too well, Japp. She says she found papers. Suppose those papers prove that Havisham's mistake ruined her husband, and that someone else profited by it. What then? Japp grunted. Revenge, eh? Possible. But she didn't strike me as the stabbing sort. No, indeed, Poirot agreed. Our murderer, I think, is of another kind, one who acts with calculation, not passion. Someone who wishes not merely to kill, but to tidy away a danger. They had reached the late Mr. Havisham's house, a narrow brick building with lace-curtained windows and an air of severe respectability. The maid, pale and nervous, admitted them into the hall, where Miss Havisham awaited, the sister, prim and colourless as ever, her eyes red from weeping but her posture rigidly upright. You have come about Leonard, she said at once, with no trace of warmth. I hope you have found the wretch who did it. Not yet, mademoiselle, Poirot replied gently. But we draw nearer. There are questions only you can answer. I've told the police everything. My brother was a good man, quiet, honourable, respected. Poirot's eyes lingered on the framed photographs along the mantel, a young Leonard in a barrister's wig, another beside a woman he presumed was his sister, and one of both before a seaside pier. A life of order and propriety, yet not, he thought, of happiness. "Did your brother speak of anyone troubling him of late?" he asked. "Anyone he feared or wished to avoid?" She hesitated. He was not a man who spoke of fear. But there were moments, these past weeks, when he seemed preoccupied. Letters arrived which he did not show me. Once I asked, and he said only, "Old ghosts are stirring again." "Ghosts," repeated Poirot softly. "That is interesting. Ghosts seldom trouble the living unless someone calls them." She frowned. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Poirot." He smiled faintly. "It is my habit, mademoiselle. But tell me, did he leave the house on the evening of his death in good spirits?" "He was restless. He said he had an appointment that might set things right. He would not tell me with whom. I begged him not to go, for the fog was dreadful. But he laughed and said, 'It will all be clear enough before the curtain rises.' Those were his last words to me." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Before the curtain rises." An interesting choice of phrase, theatrical, yet exact. He meant, I think, both literally and metaphorically. He looked toward the writing desk in the corner. "Might I glance through his papers?" She hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "If it helps bring justice, yes." Poirot seated himself with delicate care and opened the top drawer. Inside were tidy bundles of correspondence, meticulously tied. He handled each as though it might bruise, reading quickly, silently. After some minutes he drew forth a single half-burned letter from the back of the drawer. The ink was faint, the signature torn away. Only one line remained legible. "You must meet me, the truth cannot stay buried forever." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Voila, Jap, our ghost speaks." Jap leaned closer. "No name." "None, but the writing, you see, is that of a woman. Slender, controlled, elegant, yet forceful. And what woman do we know with such a hand?" "Mrs. Linton." Miss Havisham's lips tightened. "Mrs. Linton?" "I have heard of her, a widow with far too many friends and far too little reputation." Poirot glanced at her mildly. "You dislike her, mademoiselle?" "I have never met her," she replied coldly. "But I know her sort." Poirot rose. It is often dangerous to know the sort, and not the person. One confuses them. He gave a small bow. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. There is one small matter more. Did your brother ever mention the house opposite? The one presently under repair?" "The empty one?" she asked. "No. Though now you mention it, he did once complain of someone watching from that direction. He said he had seen a light there late at night, though no tenants had yet moved in." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "A light? At what hour?" "Close to midnight." He was quite disturbed by it. Poirot exchanged a glance with Jap. "Then it seems, mon ami, that our murderer may have rehearsed his crime long before the performance." As they stepped back into the cold air of Belgrave Lane, Jap thrust his hands into his pockets. "So Havisham knew something, Linton wrote to him, and someone silenced him before he could talk. The question is, who gains by that?" Poirot's voice was quiet. "Who indeed? But remember, Jap, there are two sides to every shadow. Perhaps it is not Mrs. Linton who fears exposure, but someone else connected with that old case." Jap frowned. "The husband's dead." "Just so. Which leaves us the question, who profited by his ruin?" Poirot turned suddenly toward the far end of the street, where a figure in a dark coat was disappearing around the corner. For an instant, Poirot thought he recognized the slouching walk, the nervous, hunched gait of Albert Longley, the painter. He watched until the figure was gone, then said softly, "There goes the man who paints walls, and perhaps paints truth also. But truth, when painted too thickly, begins to crack." Japp sighed. "You're in one of your moods again, Poirot. So where do we go from here?" "To my rooms, mon ami," said Poirot. "For I must think, and when Hercule Poirot thinks, the world must be very quiet." That evening, alone beneath the glow of his desk lamp, Poirot arranged his notes in careful rows. He murmured as he worked, each phrase distinct as a step along a staircase of reason. Leonard Havisham, once a man of honor, burdened by guilt. Clara Linton, widow of the wronged, seeking truth. Albert Longley, painter of walls, sees but does not speak. Miss Havisham, sister devoted, yet bitter, perhaps too bitter. And between them all, a house empty, yet not empty. He paused, touching the half-burned letter thoughtfully. Someone watched from the shadows. Someone feared discovery. And when the truth began to stir, they struck, not from rage, but from necessity. He leaned back, his eyes half closed, the faintest smile curling beneath his moustache. "Ah, mon Dieu," he whispered, "the little grey cells begin to arrange themselves. One more visit, one more question, and the curtain will indeed rise. Then, voila, we shall see who stands in the spotlight." Outside, the wind moved softly through Belgrave Lane, stirring the fallen leaves. In one of the darkened windows opposite, a faint light glimmered, then vanished. Chapter 7: The House Opposite. The night was once again heavy with fog, the sort that dulls every sound and makes the lamplight hang in the air like pale smoke. Belgrave Lane seemed deserted, its houses shuttered, its windows blind. Yet within that silence, Hercule Poirot moved with his usual unhurried precision, his gloved hands clasped behind his back and his cane tapping lightly on the damp stones. Inspector Japp followed a few steps behind, muttering, "I don't see why this couldn't wait till morning. Empty house, cold night, and we're sneaking about like burglars." Poirot smiled faintly. "But of course, mon ami, it is precisely at night that burglars do their best work. And since our murderer is one of them in spirit, we must think as he thinks." He paused before the vacant house opposite number 7. Its windows loomed black against the fog. A single lamp from the corner post cast a wan gleam over the flaking paint and the ladder still leaning against the wall. Poirot regarded it with something approaching affection. "Ah, mon brave ladder," he murmured. "You have served two masters, one honest, one not. Tonight, we shall discover which is which." Japp fitted the key into the lock. "The agent lent me this, says only the workman Longleys had access. Let's see what your hunch brings." The door creaked open with a faint groan. Inside, the air was cold and musty, smelling of dust and paint. Their lanterns threw long, wavering shadows along the narrow hall. Poirot closed the door softly behind them. "You see, Japp, here is our stage. The murder was the performance, and this house, the theatre." They moved room to room. The ground floor was bare except for a few paint tins and ladders. Upstairs, in the front room overlooking the street, stood a small trestle table, a chair, and a single candle burned low in its holder. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Someone watched from here," he said softly. "See, the wax has run down in lines. It was used only once, for some time, perhaps an hour. And from this window, one may see the Havisham house perfectly." Japp peered out through the grime. "All right, so someone watched. That doesn't prove murder." Poirot's eye swept the room. "Patience, mon ami. Observe further, footprints in the dust, 2 sets, faint but clear. One belongs to Longley, no doubt. The other, smaller, narrower, more elegant. He knelt, studying the prints. A lady's shoe, I think. Size 4 or 5. And look, the heel was chipped. We have seen such a shoe before. Japp's brow furrowed. You mean Mrs. Linton? Poirot shook his head. Perhaps. Or perhaps another woman of refinement who visits quietly, unseen. Do not forget the sister, Mademoiselle Havisham. Japp looked astonished. The sister? What reason would she have? Poirot rose, brushing dust from his knees. Reason, my friend, is the soil from which motive grows. We must only dig deep enough to find its roots. They continued their search. In a corner cupboard lay a small box of matches, a half-empty bottle of cheap gin, and, to Poirot's delight, a scrap of torn paper. He unfolded it carefully. It read simply, "He will come at 7:30. Wait. Bring the letter." Japp whistled. That's our note to Havisham. Mais non, said Poirot. It is a copy of the note, a draft, written perhaps by the same hand. Someone prepared the message here, then destroyed the rest. The ink blotting, the shaky line, a person unused to deception, yet determined. He folded the scrap neatly. So you see, Japp, the killer wrote this in this very room, and from this room watched for his victim to appear. When Havisham left his home, the killer descended by the ladder, met him in the fog, and struck. Japp scratched his chin. Then climbed back up, wiped the knife, and slipped away before anyone noticed. Neat, I'll give you that. But who? Ah, said Poirot, his eyes bright, that is the question the fog itself will answer. He crossed to the window, opened it a fraction, and looked down at the glistening street below. The lamplight caught his face in delicate outline, the perfect ovoid head, the immaculate moustaches, the stillness of intense thought. Then he spoke, very softly, someone approaches. Japp started. Where? Poirot motioned for silence. Footsteps sounded faintly through the fog, hesitant, light, then stopping beneath the window. A shape emerged from the mist, a woman's figure, cloaked, her face hidden by a veil. She paused, looked about, and raised her head toward the house. Poirot whispered, quickly, extinguish the light. They stood in darkness as the footsteps moved closer. A soft scraping followed, metal on wood. Poirot's lips curved slightly. The ladder, he murmured. She climbs. Slowly, steadily, the rungs creaked. Japp's hand tightened on his revolver, but Poirot laid a finger to his lips. No violence, mon ami. Let her show us what she fears. A pale hand appeared on the sill, then another. The window opened wider, and the woman stepped into the room. She wore a grey cloak, damp with fog, and beneath the veil, Poirot glimpsed the drawn features of Mrs. Clara Linton. She froze when she saw them. Oh! Her hand flew to her throat. What are you doing here? Poirot bowed slightly. 1,000 pardons, madam. It is rather I who should ask the question. Why does one visit an empty house at midnight? Her voice trembled. I came for a letter. One that was lost here. It concerns my late husband. I thought. Poirot held up the scrap of paper. This letter, perhaps. She stared at it, stricken. Where did you find that? In the place where it was written, said Poirot quietly. By you. She took an involuntary step backward. No. I wrote to Mr. Havisham, yes, but I didn't kill him. I believe you, said Poirot gently. But there is another who might not wish your letter to be seen, one who knew what it revealed. She looked bewildered. Who? Who could care about my husband's old ruin now? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Someone who profited by it, and by your silence." At that instant, another sound broke the stillness, a creak from below. Poirot turned sharply. "Ah," he said softly, "we are not alone." A shadow moved in the doorway, the thin, hunched figure of Albert Longley, his face pale, his eyes glittering with fear. He stammered, "I didn't mean to, I only came for my things." Poirot stepped forward. "Your things, monsieur? Or your secrets?" Longley's gaze darted to the window. "You don't understand. I had no choice, she was going to expose it all." Japp raised his revolver. "Don't move." The painter backed against the wall, trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen. He threatened me, said he'd tell her everything about the false accounts, the money. I only meant to stop him, just to scare him." Poirot's voice was calm, cold, absolute. "And so you killed him?" Longley gave a strangled sob. "He'd ruined her husband, used my name on the papers to hide it. I did his dirty work, forged the signatures, took the blame. When she wrote to him, he panicked, said he'd make me take the fall again. I followed him that night. I only meant to stop him talking." Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone was iron. "You stopped him forever. You struck him down, then hid here while the fog covered your escape. But the fog, monsieur, it clears, always." Japp stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming. "Albert Longley, I arrest you for the murder of Leonard Havisham." Longley sagged against the wall, defeated. "It was all for nothing," he muttered. "She'd never have known." "Never?" Poirot looked at him gravely. "Perhaps not. But guilt, monsieur, guilt always finds its way home." When the painter had been led away, Poirot turned to Mrs. Linton, who stood silent, pale as the fog outside. "You see, madam," he said gently, "you were the bait, though you did not know it. Your letter stirred the past, and the past reached out with a knife." She shivered. "And to think, he watched from here, waiting." Poirot nodded. "Yes." The street of silent footsteps, and every step led to truth. Chapter 8, The Curtain Falls. 2 evenings later, in the quiet drawing room of number 7, Belgrave Lane, the air seemed to hold its breath. A coal fire burned low upon the hearth, the shadows it cast trembled gently upon the walls. At the small table near the window sat Hercule Poirot, immaculate as ever, his eyes bright and serene. Facing him were Inspector Japp, solid and watchful, Mrs. Clara Linton, pale but composed, and Miss Havisham, the dead man's sister, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Poirot surveyed them with a mild smile. "Mesdames, monsieur, I have asked you here tonight to perform the final act of our little drama. The curtain, as they say, must fall." Japp gave a short nod. "We've got our man, Albert Longley. Confessed the stabbing, the forgery, the whole business. The courts will see to him soon enough." Poirot inclined his head. Indeed, the painter Longley held the knife. "But," and here his eyes twinkled faintly, "you know me, my friend, I am a man who must arrange the picture just so. There is always, behind the act, a reason, and behind the reason, a truth." Miss Havisham's voice was cold and brittle. "Surely the truth is plain. That man murdered my brother." "Oh, mademoiselle," said Poirot softly. "He killed your brother. But do you not wish to know why? For it is not the hand that interests me, but the mind that guided it." She hesitated, her chin lifting proudly. "If you must, Mr. Poirot, though I cannot see the purpose of raking up more pain." Poirot's fingers tapped together. "Pain, perhaps, but also peace, mademoiselle. For I think your brother carried a pain of his own, one long buried." He turned to Mrs. Linton. "You, madam, began this affair with your letter, a letter written in good faith, yes?" She inclined her head. Yes. I only wanted to understand what had truly happened years ago, why my husband's name was destroyed. I never imagined it would lead to death. And yet it did, Poirot murmured. Let us look, then, at what your letter set in motion. Years ago, Arthur Linton was accused of fraud. He died disgraced, but not guilty. The real culprit, I discovered, was Leonard Havisham himself. A low gasp escaped Mrs. Linton. Miss Havisham stiffened. How dare you, she cried. My brother was an honourable man. Poirot raised a placating hand. Patience, mademoiselle. Honourable, perhaps once, but human, always. He speculated with clients' funds, using his junior clerk, Albert Longley, to falsify documents. When the scheme collapsed, the blame fell upon Linton, who had trusted him. Your brother, tormented by guilt, made quiet restitution and retired, but the shame, you see, was never wiped away. Japp whistled softly. So that's why Longley had him by the throat. He held the evidence all along. Just so, said Poirot. For years, Longley lived quietly, until Mrs. Linton's letter arrived, a spark in dry tinder. Havisham knew that her discovery would destroy him. He wrote in return, asking her to meet him privately, hoping perhaps to plead, perhaps to confess. But Longley learned of the meeting. He had been watching, afraid his own part might come to light. He prepared a false note, luring Havisham into the fog an hour before the theatre appointment. There, in the narrow street, he struck. Poirot paused, his voice softening. It was not rage that moved him, but fear, fear of exposure, fear of ruin. And yet, as always, the act of concealment revealed more than it hid. Mrs. Linton's eyes filled with tears. Then my husband, he truly was innocent. Poirot inclined his head gravely. Entirely, madam. Leonard Havisham's guilt was the shadow that destroyed both your husband and himself. You sought justice, and you have it, though it came at a bitter price. A silence fell. The fire crackled softly. Miss Havisham sat motionless, her face pale as marble. Poirot regarded her gently. You are very quiet, mademoiselle. She raised her eyes to his. What is there to say? You have stripped away everything. My brother, a liar, a thief, and now a fool who met his end in the gutter. Is that justice? Poirot's tone was compassionate but firm. It is truth, mademoiselle. Justice, alas, is a matter for the heart, ideal only in truth. She gave a small, strangled laugh. Then your truth has killed what little of my heart was left. Perhaps, he said softly, but the heart, mademoiselle, is like the street outside. It looks deserted, yet life stirs beneath the fog. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Japp cleared his throat. It's a sad case, all round. I'll see to the formal statement in the morning. But Poirot was not finished. His eyes, sharp as needles, lingered on Miss Havisham. There is one last point, a small one, yet curious. She stiffened. What point? Poirot rose, walking to the mantelpiece. He touched a silver photograph frame, then turned it slightly. When we first visited, mademoiselle, I noticed this picture had been turned face down. Only yesterday did I see it restored. It is a portrait of your brother, yes, but inscribed on the back are words in another hand, to Leonard, with my faith, C.L. Mrs. Linton gasped. That was my handwriting. I sent it to him years ago, when my husband and he were friends. He must have kept it all this time. Poirot bowed slightly. Just so. It tells me, you see, that your brother loved you still, madam, even as he destroyed your peace. Perhaps his meeting with you was not only to confess, but to seek forgiveness. Miss Havisham's expression softened a fraction. He never spoke of her to me. No, said Poirot gently. Because he knew you would not understand. Your brother lived in remorse, mademoiselle, and remorse is a prison one builds for oneself. He turned toward the window. That is why I call this street the street of silent footsteps. Each of us walks there, carrying our secrets, our guilt, our grief, unheard by others, until truth breaks the silence. Japp rose, stretching stiffly. You've done it again, Poirot. Neat and tidy, as always. Poirot smiled faintly. Order, mon ami, it is the passion of my soul. The world, it falls into chaos so easily. One must restore the balance, even if it costs a little pain. He reached for his hat and cane. Come, Japp. We have finished our work. The rest belongs to time. As they stepped outside, the evening fog curled once more through Belgrave Lane, soft and cold. The gas lamps flickered weakly against the mist. Poirot paused, looking back toward the shuttered windows of number 7. You see, Japp, he murmured, even now the street remembers. A cry, a fall, a secret uncovered. But soon the footsteps will fade, and silence will return, as it always does. Japp glanced sideways at him. And you, Poirot? Don't you ever tire of digging up other people's secrets? Poirot smiled, his moustache gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Ah, mon ami, I am like the gardener who tends a neglected garden. I do not dig for pleasure, I dig for order. And when I have found it, I rest. They walked on together through the fog, their footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement, the last two sounds in the street of silent footsteps.